Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Thought I'd do another video right on the heels of my Japanese video. There were some comments to my Japanese video saying that I'm much more enthusiastic when I speak in foreign languages or speak in Japanese, so I'm going to try to be a little less monotonous when I speak English here. The Japanese video talked about how, it's important for success in language learning. It's important to have fun with language learning, that if it's drudgery, we aren't going to learn. And too often in language classes, it is drudgery. Here in Canada, they force kids to learn the tenses before the kids have any sense of the language. And in Japan, there's this tremendous emphasis on tests, and the bookstores are just full of manuals on how to ace TOEFL for a bunch of people that, or TOEIC, who have very little sense of the language because they haven't listened to it, they haven't read it. So that was my Japanese video, and one of the questions was, I'm trying to be enthusiastic here, how did I learn Japanese? And so I thought I would do a quickie on that. Haven't really given it much thought, but remember that I was in Hong Kong where it was my job to learn Chinese. And so there I went at it literally 10 hours a day. I had 3 hours a day of classroom instruction, one-on-one. So I was speaking from day one, to get back to that Benny paradigm. I was speaking from day one, but with teachers who were drilling me initially, and then we would have conversations as soon as I was able to have conversations. And then I would go home and I would listen and read, and I would work on my characters. And within 3 months, I was, reading the newspaper, People's Daily, and this kind of thing, and so forth. And a big part of my learning there was simply finding things to read, because I've always been convinced that reading, and then if you have the opportunity to listen to the same content, which wasn't always the case then, I'll just let that ring, that's the home phone, that enhances the perception that you're able to make. Obviously, it's easier to read than to listen for quite a long time. So that was my experience with Chinese, and my major emphasis in Chinese was patterns. In Chinese, there are patterns. I didn't understand the various grammatical explanations, but, as in English, if you say, if you do something, then I will do something. Or, given the fact that, therefore, and so all of these patterns, and in Chinese, it's like, you go, not go, is how they say, are you going? So, patterns. I wanted to really get used to the patterns of Chinese. So, the reason I ended up in Japan, by the way, is that I had a boss in the Canadian, called High Commission, the Canadian Consulate in Hong Kong, and I had been assigned to learn Chinese with the goal that I would go up to Beijing as soon as Canada recognized, or Canada and China established diplomatic relations. And the person who was going to be my boss there was my boss in Hong Kong, and I felt that he was a complete jerk. And, he would do things like, he was very much, threatened by the fact that I was learning Chinese, because he was the resident expert on China, and if anyone important came through Hong Kong, he would send me off for 2 days to do research somewhere, just so that they couldn't see that there was somebody else here who might know something about China in addition to him. So I said, I'm not going to China with this guy. I'm not going to spend, 2 or 3 years in a relatively isolated post, which is what Beijing was in those days, with a guy who plays these kind of mind games. I said, but I will go to Japan and I will learn Japanese on my own. It won't cost the government a penny, because the government, after all, paid for my Chinese learning. So with that, I once they agreed that I was going to go to Japan, I bought whatever book I could find in Hong Kong, and I started reading the book, and it had tapes. And I remember the greeting that they had in that book was omeni, like if you meet someone, omeni kakarete taihen koe ni zonjimasu. That was what I was confronted with. That was how you greet people. Well, never in Japan in 9 years or subsequently have I ever heard anyone say that. But that was their greeting, which is kind of interesting, because ever since then, I have no great sense of belief of anything they give me in a book. But it doesn't matter. I just absorb it. It doesn't matter. So I was reading this book, and I can't remember the name of the book. And then I had a friend who was at the Japanese consulate in Hong Kong who wanted to learn English, and we were both Chinese learners. So twice a week we would meet for Chinese lunch, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and probably most of the conversation was in Chinese, which was our common language, but we would do a little bit of English and a little bit of Japanese. So that kind of whet my appetite. And then I arrived in Japan, and basically what I did was just listen and read. As you know, I don't believe in this idea that you can just arrive somewhere after looking at a phrase book and go out and start talking to people. I just think that's just impractical. You have nothing to say. You don't understand what they're saying. Most people have no patience for you. However, my goal was to get to a level where I could talk to people as soon as possible. So I do remember some of the early material that I read. Naganuma, the Naganuma readers, terribly boring, but lots of content, all in hiragana. Because the first thing you got to do is to learn the hiragana. So reading all of these, and it was extremely boring stuff, but I just went through until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had the advantage of being able to read Chinese characters. So text that had more kanji in it was actually easier for me. The hiragana was more difficult. The katakana in Japanese is a real pain in the neck. I don't like it. I have trouble reading it. I try to avoid it, because the katakana is used for foreign words, is used for words that represent the sound of something like crash or bang. So I just skip those because I'm not going to bother. Like I'll learn the hiragana. I'll figure out how the kanji is pronounced in Japanese, but the katakana, I just don't even bother with it. I just think it's silly to even have it. Japanese people get mad at me, but I just didn't bother with it. So Naganuma was one, and then I can't remember all the little readers that I would find, but just as I did in Hong Kong, I would go to the bookstore and see what I could find. Beginner readers, even beginner textbooks. Ignore all the grammar, ignore all the exercises. Just read the dialogue, grab some of the patterns that they'll introduce in each lesson, go back and listen, read. And so, that's always been my approach to language learning. Listen, read, review words, review patterns. Then I can remember some of the material that I enjoyed listening to. For example, Izu no Odoriko, which is a very famous novel by Kawabata Yasunari. And I was able to get an audiobook of that. And my family and I were touring in Izu in our little old car. And wherever we went, the whole family had to listen to Izu no Odoriko, the story. And we went to some of the towns that this group of dancers visited. I also remember a marvelous tape set that I found called Showa no Kiroku, which was a history of the events of the Showa era, and it included all kinds of contemporary radio programs describing all of the events that happened during the Showa era. I don't know how many times I listened to that, and I didn't understand much at first, and gradually I understood more and more. Now, unlike the Izu no Odoriko, there was no text, so I was relying on just listening. In an ideal scenario, you have text, and of course we live in an even more ideal world for learning today because we can carry a little iPod around, and I can read on my iPod, I can listen from my iPod, we've got online dictionaries, we've got Link, so things are much better. But then, it was just a matter of listening and reading and getting up the sufficient, vocabulary. Then I worked at the Canadian Embassy, and all of our working life was in English at the embassy. And of course, I was in no position to speak Japanese to our, the business people as a trade commissioner that I was supposed to be dealing with. But I had an assistant whose name was Nick Yazaki. And Nick Yazaki is extremely long-winded, speaks very slowly, or I assume he's still alive, I don't know, spoke very slowly, and normally said the same thing about 3 times. So he was the ideal person to start speaking with. So basically, once I had enough vocabulary that I could start, with much hesitation saying some things to Nick, he was my teacher. So we would talk, we did, a bit of a conversation in here. We also had to work. So that Nick was kind of my trainer, personal trainer. And then after a while, I started using it in different situations. And once you're launched and speaking, well, you're off to the races. But I would always continue looking for readers, advanced Japanese, whatever. Because again, as with Chinese, we didn't have online dictionaries. I didn't want to look through a dictionary. I figured if I could find all the possible readers that are out there with glossary, and if I could master that vocabulary, I'd be well on my way. And that was the case. And of course, I had the advantage that I could, fairly quickly read the newspaper, because a lot of the vocabulary there was similar. So if I can read the newspaper, then I can listen to the news, and it's again the same vocabulary. So basically that was it. And over time, I got better and better. Obviously, the melodrama, the soap operas, the movies are much more difficult to listen to. That took me a long time. Watching baseball games was my first introduction to Japanese on television, because you could kind of figure out what was happening, So basically that was it. A lot of listening and reading to get myself, ready, trying to pick up on the patterns of the language until I was able to speak to people. And then once you're able to speak, then you can improve pretty quickly. So I hope that is helpful. Thank you for listening.